All right. So the next section we're going to talk about is we're going to dive into U.S. slavery. I know, I mean, everyone's learned a little bit about slavery in our schools, but there's actually an enormous amount, a lot of realities around U.S. slavery, particularly how it it operated, and also how it affected and involved, and how it created the United States that we often don't talk about in our school systems. I think a really great book came out like 2014, 15, something like that. It's pretty new. Is Edward Baptiste's book, the Half That Has Never Been Told. This is, I mean, a lot of times we feel like we know a lot about slavery, but if you read this book, you're going to realize how little you actually know. This is a fantastic book that really kind of does what our schools, fail to do, is really, creates a solid understanding of not only the foundations of U.S. slavery, but also how it created, not only it created American capitalism, it created the United States, it created so much of the Western world from the U.S. slavery. So it's a really fantastic book, and a lot of things that we're going to be talking about in this section. It comes out of this book along with a couple additional things from different resources. But I'm going to start out with another really great equal justice initiative. A little short, movie. It's real short, but it's really great about talking about like kind of the history of our slavery and how that evolved eventually to mass incarceration, which is something that we're going to be kind of diving into in the other chapters. But I think it does a really great job kind of capturing the foundations of our slavery system.
In 1619, when the first Africans were brought to the British colonies by ship to Jamestown, Virginia, they held the legal status of servant. But as the region's economic system became increasingly dependent on forced labor, we descended into slavery. The institution of American slavery developed as a permanent, hereditary system centrally tied to race. Millions of black people were forcibly taken from Africa, crammed on ships, and brought to the Americas through a dangerous and deadly journey that crossed the Atlantic. Millions died. Once on our shores, slavery deprived the enslaved person of any legal rights or autonomy, and granted the slave owner complete power over the black men, women, and children legally recognized as property. An ideology of white supremacy, a narrative of racial difference was created to rationalize and justify the continuation of slavery. American slavery was often brutal, barbaric, and violent. In addition to the hardship of forced labor, enslaved people were maimed or killed by slave owners as punishment for working too slowly, visiting a spouse living on another plantation, or even learning to read. Enslaved people were also sexually exploited. The United States Congress finally banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808. Slavery was widely considered a gross human rights violation, yet enslavement was retained and persisted. The 1808 Declaration caused the demand for slave labor to skyrocket in the Lower South, and the domestic slave trade grew to meet this demand. Between 1808 and 1860, the enslaved population of Alabama grew from less than 40,000 to more than 435,000. Slave traders chained African Americans together in couples and forced them to march hundreds of miles from the Upper South to the Lower South. Steamboats carried slaves along the Alabama River. Rail routes constructed with slave labor brought hundreds of enslaved people to Montgomery, Alabama every day, turning the city into one of the largest slave trading communities in the United States. Enslaved people would be paraded up Commerce Street to slave warehouses and slave depots. The city's slave market was at the Artesian Basin, now known as Court Square. Enslaved people of all ages were auctioned along with livestock, standing in line to be inspected. Public posters advertising the sale of slaves included gender, age, skill, complexion, owner's name, and price. Slavery in America traumatized and devastated millions of people. Husbands and wives, parents and children could not protect themselves from being sold away from each other. Enslaved families were separated at an owner's or auctioneer's whim, never to see each other again. The domestic slave trade separated nearly half of all enslaved people from their spouses and parents. In 1833, the Alabama legislature banned free black people from residing in the state, meaning that enslavement was the only legally authorized status for African Americans. Even as the Civil War raged, slave trading in Montgomery flourished well into the mid-1860s. After the Confederacy's surrender in 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery nationwide except as a punishment for crime. But in many former slave states, slavery did not end, it simply evolved. Southern whites, angry after losing the war, targeted black people who were largely abandoned by the federal government in the 1870s. For decades, black men, women, and children were tortured, terrorized, and killed by mobs and violent lynchings, oppressed by a system of racist laws and customs. For another 100 years, black people were racially segregated, denied the right to vote, education, and basic dignity. They were humiliated, beaten, or killed for minor offenses or for protesting. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s helped to end legally authorized racial segregation, but racial bias still persists. Today, a presumption of guilt is assigned to many people of color who are disproportionately arrested, convicted of crimes, and sent to prison. African Americans are 6 times more likely to be sentenced to prison for the same crime as a white person. 1 in 3 black males born today can expect to spend time in prison during his lifetime. Police violence against black people is so epidemic that civil rights demonstrations have shut down cities across the U.S. as thousands of people march to protest police brutality. Many states celebrate the era of slavery with Confederate holidays and by honoring the defenders and architects of slavery while ignoring the history of enslavement. The Equal Justice Initiative believes that racial bias remains a serious problem and is a direct and lasting legacy of American slavery and our failure to deal with the history of racial injustice. The Equal Justice Initiative seeks to foster an honest conversation about the legacy of slavery, about mass incarceration, and racial inequality and how it still affects millions of people today. We can confront and overcome bias and discrimination. Please join us in this conversation so that we can move forward together.
All right. So that again, the Equal Justice Initiative. That was Brian Stevenson. He talked earlier in this class, and we're probably going to see a lot of videos from him because he's the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. Amazing organization, and I really like how they tie. They do a really great job tying slavery to a lot of things, a lot of racial biases and a racial a racist criminal justice system that we see today. Often says the biggest sin of slavery isn't so much the institution of slavery, but it was the racial hierarchy that was created to justify slavery, and that never went away. That is something that still persists today in our criminal justice system. This idea that black people were inferior, they were violent, they were uncivilized, and they needed institutions like slavery, and then afterwards needed institutions like sharecropping and convict leasing, and they needed violence to be controlled with like lynching and white terrorism. So all these things that was and Brian Stevenson he always talks about that's one of the biggest legacies of slavery is that we're left with this racial bias and these racial hierarchies and all these racial internalizations that we're still dealing with today. So that's why it's so important to understand slavery and not only understand the realities of slavery, but how it's still connected today and how it's still pushing, policies and then, biases today. All right, so kind of want to start from the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade and kind of work our way through the history of it, particularly around how it affected colonial North America and eventually United States. And we talked a lot about this particularly last class in the colonialism class, so I won't spend too much time on the origins of this, but I want to kind of, for people that didn't watch the last class, I want to lay a foundation. And there's a couple of important concepts as well that came out of the transatlantic slave trade, such as this idea of black people and of racism and race, is something that that wasn't around, was invented, to justify the transatlantic slave trade and didn't really exist years beforehand. But transatlantic slave trade. So I mean, there's been slave trades, probably since the beginning of civilization. People have been trading slaves or enslaved people. And this is nothing new, but this is a new type of slavery that we'll talk about, that forms with the transatlantic slave trade. That's mainly built. It's a racial, it's a racial hereditary system that the world has never really has not seen before. And essentially, so Portugal, so Europe and Africa and particularly Eastern Europe, there was a slave trade going, where mainly most of the enslaved people were Eastern Europeans, particularly Slavic people. That's where the word slave comes from. It's actually it's Slavic for Slavs. Primarily, people would be, kidnapped and stolen into the slave trade from Eastern Europe, and then would, be sold throughout, Western Europe and Northern Africa, and then be kind of sent around the world. So this was nothing new, but eventually the Eastern Europeans became more organized, became more fortified, were able to better defend themselves against slave raids. So this made it much more complicated. Portugal was the first to kind of look, elsewhere for where to enslave people, and they decided to first start going to kind of western, northern, and then mid. They started focusing on Africa, and they started conquering several coastal towns in Africa and turning those into slave markets, and then started working with local tribes and kingdoms, and started a trade system, basically, where they traded all kinds of things like advanced arms and things for enslaved people, which eventually we talked a lot about this last class, and eventually created this arms deal where even if African nations didn't want to participate and didn't want in the slave trade, they saw their other whether the kingdoms that maybe their rivals that are warring with all of a sudden get all kinds of advanced European arms, which at first wasn't so advanced, but eventually became very, very advanced weaponry, and so if they didn't participate, then they became invulnerable. So it almost created this arms race where African nations had to participate. Even the ones that tried not to and even rebelled were forced to participate. So we often sell this myth that Africans are responsible for selling themselves into slavery, African kingdoms, when in reality, like, we created enormous demand through colonization that was almost forced upon in many ways on African nations. And that demand really came from colonialism. They started in Spain and Portugal were the first, but eventually other England and France started setting up colonies all over the country, all over Americas. The Spanish and the Portuguese in South America and Central America, and then and then some in America, then Britain, and almost had the coast, and France, and a lot of North America, and some islands in West Indies and Caribbean. And they basically created these, they basically exported this new capitalism system they created that was really focused on this creating as much profit as possible through exploitation of land and labor. So they stole, they conquered, because when they came over to the Americas, all this land was considered common area. So they stole that and privatized it and basically killed any indigenous person that tried to stop them. And then they enslaved, at first, so then they created what's called plantation systems. With Spain created more of an encomida systems, but Spain, which was like similar to a feudal system where that just basically enslaved everyone and forced them into mines and farms, and but very similar. France and Britain and other countries set up these plantation systems where their first colonies were essentially corporations. That like the Virginia Company and Plymouth Company, and they came over and they set up, they made these colonies. These were investments. They were commissioned by the crowns, but they were mainly investors. They were investing money into basically creating these plantation systems to basically grow as much cash crops and extract as much resources as possible from basically stolen indigenous land, and also exploited labor, and then bring that wealth back to Europe. And that labor was, at first it was enslaved indigenous people, and that worked well well, better in America, Central and South America, but eventually it was, a lot of indigenous, resistance made it a lot harder. So then they turned to indentured servants, which, some of these people signed up, where they committed to, work 7 years, pay for the cost of their voyage, and they would get some land and benefits. But other people, as we talked about, this was actually a form of criminalizing poverty, and people that refused to work in factories were actually criminalized, anti-vagabond laws, and forced into this indentured servitude. And then eventually, that didn't work out as well as they wanted, and eventually they turned to enslaved Africans. So that's where Portugal, they set up the system, before a lot of this colonialism in the 1400s, where they, by conquering different coastal towns. But at first they were just bringing the enslaved people up to Europe and selling around there. And then once the colonies, they started forming colonies. They started this triangle trade where they would go down, they would buy enslaved people, bring them to their colonies in South America, Brazil, and then bring them back to Europe, and bring back the cash crops back to Europe, and then it's created what we call the transatlantic slave trade. And eventually Spain joined, England, France, Dutch, and eventually this ultimately over a span of a couple centuries, this 12 million enslaved Africans were shipped to Americas. Most of them went to Brazil and many of the Caribbean islands, where just horrific conditions on sugar plantations, where many people didn't survive. I think that some of these life expectancy was like 3 to 7 years. They weren't even trying to like reproduce slaves. They were just trying to work them to death and bring new ones in. It was pretty horrific. But 500,000 enslaved people made it to North America, where they started, it came into these corporation colonies, the Virginia Company and the Plymouth Company, and where they were forced to work in plantations, mainly tobacco. At first it was mainly tobacco plantations, and then expanded to other things like indigo and rice, and eventually cotton, and also sugar. There was some sugar plantations in the South that we'll talk about. It was a horrific situation. If you look, they just packed as many people as possible, and they were just, and this is really what makes it, makes this system different than in past slave systems. Is essentially, Portugal, when they started, creating these slave trades and started conquering coastal towns, they were a Christian nation, so they wanted to, create this justification and make them seem like good people for making an enormous amount of profit by, basically destroying people and trafficking people. So they hired this guy, Gomez de Zora, to go down and kind of record what was happening. And he basically created this idea of Black people. He summarized all African people as one group of people, and they were Black people, and he considered them inferior to Europeans. At this time, white wasn't invented yet. That didn't happen until the 1700s. So it was mainly people just talked about your, ethnicities and cultures and things, but there was no such thing as race at this point. So they created the first race, which was Black people, and these were, he called them beasts and savages, and he basically called it, talked about how they were uncivilized and how Europe was bringing civilization, was bringing Christianity to Africa, and that, by enslaving these people, we were actually helping these people, and that's the justification that they used to justify making an enormous amount of profit off an enormous amount of suffering. And that, it's funny, it's like each European country that joined, all of a sudden, like England, Spain joined, all of a sudden they adopted these ideas as well. This idea that Black people were inferior, there's a racial hierarchy, and with Europeans on top and Black people on the bottom, and that eventually, spread throughout Europe, to help justify making all this money off these systems. I mean, to be clear, they knew how horrific these systems were. But then, that was eventually, these ideas were transferred to the colonies, this anti-Blackness, along mixed with anti-Indigenous, as well, ideas that were forming at this time. And so this new slave system was created. Basically, it's a racialized slave system that was basically like Black people were inferior and deserved to be slaves. And so, we saw these new colonial laws that emerged, and we'll talk about some of them, later in the section. But they essentially dictated that all Black people were property, that did not deserve rights, and that their enslavement was hereditary. So this was a new system. We never, old systems of slavery was more like indentured servitudes, where it was like temporarily, or they were prisoners of war, or it was like some feudal system, like, and they were serfs, which they had like access to commons and things like that. And there was like, it was bad, but not, definitely not in the level that I mean, it's important to understand, because a lot of people say, oh, slavery existed, a long time ago, and you can't really compare, this stuff, but this was a really horrific form of slavery, in a new form that we've never seen before, a racialized, chattel slavery, a property. These people had no rights; they were property, and that is the kind of a system that we haven't really, seen so much, that we haven't seen exactly like this before, and that just became this horrific system, that just and I would read this, like, just to show that the level that we looked at these people as just property, that we objects, that we dehumanize them. This is Renee Edelage. She wrote "Why I'm No Longer Talking About Racism and White People," but she writes, and sorry, some Zoom stuff is blocking some of this stuff, but let me see if I can read all of it. Profit and loss also meant documenting the deaths of Black cattle because it was bad for business. The vast slave ships that transported Black people across the Atlantic were severely cramped. The journey could take up to 3 months. The space around each slave was coffin-like, consigning them to live among filth and bodily fluids. The dead and dying were thrown overboard for cash flow reasons. Insurance money could be collected for those slaves that died at sea. So that's how little, value that they had on looking. I mean, they just completely dehumanized and objectified these people to property, and that's what really started. It's not only the slave trade, but also fuel the colonialism, and also fuel this anti-Black racism. But all right, so I'm gonna play this quick Washington Post thing that it does a really good job kind of giving an overview of just like basic numbers and things, just to give you an idea of this before we kind of dive deeper into some more of the history.
Africans were enslaved in the United States between 1619 and 1865. Approximately 12 million Africans were stolen from their homes and packed on ships, which could hold up to 600, like sardines. Many died or jumped overboard during the Middle Passage to America. The Middle Passage was a route that transported slaves from Africa. The route started in Europe, stopped in Africa, then continued to North and South America before returning to Europe. Most enslaved Africans, over 5 million, were taken to Brazil. Just over 300,000 arrived in America. The 1787 Three-Fifths Compromise counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for congressional purposes. Slaves could not vote, however. They were also banned from learning how to read and forbidden to marry outside of their race. Congress outlawed the African slave trade in 1808, but the domestic slave trade continued in the U.S. Slavery wasn't exclusive to the South, with 1/5 of New York City's population comprising of slaves in 1740. Enslaved Africans comprised 13% of the total U.S. population by 1860. Virginia had the highest number of enslaved Africans, followed by Georgia. Slaves made up 55% of the total population in Mississippi in 1860. Enslaved Africans weren't content with their deplorable living conditions in the U.S. One estimate puts the number of slave revolts at 250. One of the most notable was the Nat Turner slave revolt in 1831, where he led a group of followers and killed approximately 51 whites. Maintaining the institution of slavery was the root cause of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln wrote in 1862 that if he could, quote, save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. Nearly 179,000 Black men fought for the Union in the Civil War. The 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery in the United States on December 6, 1865.
All right, so that was kind of basic overview. I mean, that was basically information that we get, and most people got in high school. But we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of these things, some of these concepts that we kind of brush over in school. And I think the biggest one is the domestic slave trade. I mean, we really don't talk enough about this, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this, because this is one of the most impactful parts of United States slavery. And this really, started. from some, we teach a very whitewashed version of what started this, which was essentially we outlawed international slavery in 1807. We passed the law in 1807 and outlawed in 1808. But reality, I mean, that was a thing, part of a section in our Constitution that we put in, that basically said international slavery had to be banned in 20 years. And we teach this like this is something that this was like a win for abolition, or like this was, our founding fathers trying to do something good. And it's just like couldn't be further from the point. I mean, everyone knew that the value of their slaves were decreasing because of the international slave trade, particularly where Virginia, where majority of our founding fathers came from, like Thomas Jefferson, who realized if they banned international slave trade, the hundreds of slaves that they all, enslaved people that they all own, would be worth so much more. And that's the thing, is like, with the domestic slave trade, it wasn't so much about, the cash crops that enslaved people were growing, but it was about, actually breeding new enslaved people that became a commodity, that was, ended up being one of the most valuable commodity in the United States at the time, up until the Civil War. So this idea, like even after the Constitution was banned, in most states didn't wait 20 years. I mean, they banned the international slave trade right away. It was really only South Carolina, or for some reason, just kept on wanting to keep the international slave trade open, and that's eventually what pushed Thomas Jefferson to pass a law, contingent on this Constitution, to outlaw international slavery. So when they did that, it just basically exploded, domestic slave trade. And this happened at the same time. This happened, other events that we're going to talk more about were happening, like the first Industrial Revolution. A lot of people say this about mid 1700s and mid 1800s. These were factories, not just in Europe, but also in the northern states. These are new factories that opened up. Here were basically, the main product was textiles. Textiles created from cotton. And at the time, we're going to look at some numbers, in this section, but majority of the cotton that was grown for both the United States, northern states, and also Europe, came from enslaved hands. So that's important to understand. This Industrial Revolution created this huge demand. Basically, we're at this point where you can grow as much cotton as possible, and they would buy it and process it. There was no limit to how much you can grow for decent prices as well. And then, a big limit was, they used to have to separate by hand the cotton from the seeds, which was a slow process. There was a big bottleneck into this. But then the cotton gin was invented, was this machine that manually, really quickly separated seeds from cotton. And that, opened up again, all of a sudden you can grow, you didn't have to worry about bottlenecks. You can just grow as much cotton as possible. But at the same time, most of the slave plantations were tobacco farms, and they've been operating for over 100 years, some 200 years. And basically the land was dead. I mean, there was no fertility left, and they were seeing less and less decreases in fertility every year. I mean, they were just over farming these areas. I mean, that's a huge part of capitalism and colonialism and plantation economies. It's just to farm and to the point that you literally just destroy. You're trying to extract as much wealth by exploiting as much land and basically just killing the land. So there was there wasn't a whole lot of fertile land until Louisiana Purchase and an Indian Removal Act opened up hundreds of millions of acres of land, particularly around the Mississippi Valley in the South, and then that was just super fertile land that was basically gobbled up. It was stolen from indigenous people, and then gobbled up and just sold super cheaply. At the point where it's literally like, I mean, equivalent. It was like $30 an acre. Equivalent today's value. So we try to pretend like it was only rich people who owned enslaved people, but in reality, I mean, at the time, most people could if they wanted to, and that was a big part of, not only because the land was super cheap, and but also new banks, all these new banks, some of the American banks were emerging, these national banks that they're offering credit, credit to not only buy land and buy enslaved people, but also the first mortgage system was created called slave mortgages, where if you had just one enslaved person, you can use them as collateral to get a big loan to buy a whole bunch of enslaved people and a whole bunch of land. And a lot of people, they really, it blew up their plantations and really expanded their plantations really quickly through that. And not only that, our first, U.S. Bond market was, we would take these slave mortgages and create international bonds, and all over the world. I mean, particularly Europe, especially after Europe, and outlawed slavery, they were still investing and making an enormous amount of money by investing into these, slave bonds, and which provide even more credit. So all these four things were happening just as the time that we outlawed international, slave trade, and then we just see this explosion of the domestic slave trade. It just blew up, and most of the slaves were living, at the time. I mean, a lot of, probably majority. Virginia had the most of the slaves, or at least they had the most slaves of any state. But again, I mean, their tobacco plantations were done, and tobacco itself. I mean, the prices were falling internationally. And if it wasn't for cotton and all these factors, there was a chance that slavery may have, died out on its own. But cotton definitely not only resurrected it, but it created an international empire based on enslaved cotton plantations. And so we see, millions, of slaves in what we call the cotton South. There's the tobacco South, which is kind of like the top part of the South, and then the deep South is cotton South. So we see, millions of enslaved people suddenly, ripped apart from their families, sold in these horrific, slave auctions, and then just shipped down the river on ferries, or just marched in these horrible, I think it's called coffin lines, where they just chain everyone together, hire overseers that just like march them, thousands of miles south, and that's where we get like the sign, sold down the river. That was this horrific reality that enslaved people in Virginia and faced, that at any time their family could be ripped apart, and their children or could be shipped down the river, sold down south and into horrific conditions. I mean, slavery was horrific already in Virginia, but we're going to talk about just how horrible it got, once cotton, expanded. And really, 1 in 5 marriages of all slaves, were separated. Brian Stevenson in the video talked about half of all families were ripped apart. And then literally like a year after the Slave Trade Act, South Carolina ruled that enslaved women had no legal claims on their children, because they that wasn't coincidence, because they knew that the domestic slave trade was going to blow up, and they knew how profitable it was to steal children from their moms. So they passed a law legalizing it. I'm going to read this from Ta-Nehisi Coates. He writes, forced partings were common in antebellum South. A slave in some parts of the region stood 30% chance of being sold in his or her lifetime. 25% interstate trade destroyed a first marriage, and half of them destroyed a nuclear family. Here we find the roots of American wealth and democracy in the for-profit destruction of the most important asset available to any people in the family. And we just, I'm not going to get too much of it, but I mean, it's just horrific scenes of just like families, like, and babies being ripped apart and just sold. And this happened, millions of people, enslaved Black people. And then created what we call the slave trail of tears, which we don't talk about this that very much. We talk a little bit about the actual Trail of Tears after the Indian Removal Act, when okay, what's his name? It'll come to me. Andrew Jackson, when he basically, because he was what we call the populist president, where he wanted to win over not everyone, but like his base, basically. Populism can be a very dangerous thing, especially under presidents like Andrew Jackson. And his base really wanted more stolen indigenous land, so he authorized the Indian Removal Act, where he removed multiple tribes and sent them to reservations out west. And the one of them, Cherokee, refused to remove. They put up all these actually won these legal battles. But he didn't care. He didn't really respect that, and they forced them by the military, marched them out. What was called the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee were died during this horrific conditions. Thousands of them were raped, along the way. It was really, really awful. But that opened up 25 million acres of new cotton plantations. right for, all they needed was, banking credit, and then they needed, enslaved people from Virginia and some of these northern, northern southern states, like what we call the tobacco South, which is basically, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, and then there's the cotton South, which is like the deep South, and that's where, cotton can grow a lot better. So essentially, once they opened up this land, including the Louisiana Purchase, where they got that from Napoleon, who had his like great ideas of building this empire in the Americas, and then basically got his butt handed to him by the slave revolts in Haiti, and he was basically done, and he just wanted to get rid of everything. There was other reasons too. I mean, with all the wars he was going, he needed, he was overextended and things like that. But he essentially sold Louisiana Purchase to next to nothing. We credit that with like Jefferson negotiation skills, but Jefferson had nothing to do with it. He was done with it. So he sold all this land, and a lot of it had that, Mississippi Valley area, and then Texas, was also, kind of rebelling against, a lot of slave owners or enslavers came to move to Texas. It was in Mexico at the time, but then started rebelling, and then eventually, we took over, Texas to the Mexican American War, and that was mainly fought because of slavery as well, which is another reason we don't talk about. But essentially, millions of enslaved people. It was one of the biggest migrations in the history of our country before the 1900s. Were forced to march in these coffle gangs, all chained together, or sent down on ferry boats, sold down the river. And they would hire overseers to basically march these people under horrific conditions. And I want to read this from Edward Ball. And he wrote, "The slave trade of Trail Tears is a great missing migration, a 1,000-mile long river of people, all of them black, reaching from Virginia to Louisiana. During the 50 years before the Civil War, about 1 million enslaved people moved from the upper South, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, to the deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. They were made to go, deported, you could say, having been sold. This movement lasted longer and grabbed up more people than any other migration in North America before 1900s. And this includes like the great migration out west as well, including all the, lots of immigration migration, lots of other migrations that they didn't come close to what this did. And so a couple really important parts of the domestic, slave trade. One of the biggest ones is the ability to now industrialize Black women's bodies and Black women's reproduction systems. And I'm going to read another quote by Renee Edo Lodge. Black women's reproductive systems were industrialized. Children born into slavery were the default property of slave owners, and this meant limitless labor at no extra cost. That reproduction was meant all the easier by routine rape of African women slaves by white slave owners. So this really, we talked about this somewhat with the creation of whiteness in that second class, but we talked about Elizabeth Keys, and Key was a big part of how this happened. She wasn't responsible for what this happened, but she gained her freedom, and then the colonial governments reacted and created systems that allowed this to happen. So essentially, Elizabeth Key, she was born in 1630. She was into an enslaved mother and free white man. She married someone and later became a Christian, and that and she basically sued for her freedom, because under English law, which dictated colonialism up until the Revolutionary War, it basically stated the status of a child was based on the father. So if the father was free, the child was free. If the father was a slave, the child was enslaved. And then and also it said that you couldn't become you can't enslave Christians. So she successfully sued and won her freedom, but that really scared the colonial government in Virginia at the time, the Virginia House of Burgesses, and they decided to actually change the laws. And they changed one, they made it okay to enslave Christians, and then two, they passed a law basically switching the role, the status of the child was now based on the mother. And this is really significant because we're going to talk more about this during our patriarch and white supremacy society. But two of the biggest, ruling factors of our society was white supremacy patriarchy, and that mixed to the point where they created these cultural norms where it was very common for, like, a white free person to have a child with a black enslaved person. It was not, I mean, it still happened, but it had to be very hushed up, and it was like dire consequences, even lynchings if a freed white woman had a child with an enslaved black person, even though that happened a lot. And that actually, there's a lot of rape that happened. There's a lot of white women that that raped their slaves as well, or enslaved people. But that, that was a lot of, because of patriarchy and white supremacy norms, that had to be, that wasn't out in the open. No one was suing for freedom based on that. Again, like, a lot of lynching happened because of that, those scenarios. So that, so it was, one, it was very unlikely, for people, a child to meet that status, so most children now were being, were slaves, or being enslaved. Not only that, the big thing that happened is, so rape has always been used as a tool of terrorism and control, in slavery. But all of a sudden, rape became not just a form of control, but it became this economic opportunity. The more you rape, the more children enslaved women would have, and that became your property to be sold for huge profits. Ibram Kendi, writes, trash English law, the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1662, dusted off the Roman principle of partis superior ventrum, which held that among tame domestic animals, abroad belongs to the owner of the dame or mother. With this law in place, white enslavers could reap financial rewards from relations upon a Negro woman. So they literally use old Roman, cattle laws, to justify this and create this. I mean, that's how, dehumanized and objectified, this new slave system based on racism, or racial slave system was. And not only that, they created these these stereotypes about black women, because there was so much, we don't talk about this, but there's just an insane amount of rape that was happening of enslaved women. So to justify this, because again, everyone's trying to pretend like they're a good Christian, so and also they're creating racial hierarchies, and they want to be the one that's defying these hierarchies. So they create this idea of this stereotype called Jezebel. It's basically this like hypersexual, it gave a stereotype that black women were hypersexual and always wanted sex, and were once responsible for sexual relations with white males. It was a victim blaming, stereotype, basically not only covered widespread rape, but also, covered this, up this, white honor of, like, making it okay for white, people to, because they were victims of this Jezebel stereotype. So it was okay for them to rape and still be good Christians and good white people. So, Edward Kendi says, aggressive hypersexual African femininity served both to exonerate white men of their inhumane rages and to mask their human attractions to the supposed beast-like women. So Edward Baptiste writes, Thomas Jefferson admitted that unchecked power twisted white men's characters, that the man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals unbetrayed by such circumstances. So even though that was like a bunch of fancy words, basically he was saying that you had to be a saint to not rape your slaves, was basically what Thomas Jefferson was saying. And we know this, that Thomas Jefferson was an active participant in the rape of his 14-year-old, Sally Hemings, enslaved woman, and they had multiple children. And so, that's what's it's important, going back to why we need to recognize that Thomas Jefferson was a rapist, because it wasn't just him, it was all colonial, all enslavers were rapists, and the racism and the racist stereotypes they used to justify and to hide their rape, are stereotypes that are still used today against black women. That's the hypersexual, the loud, the confrontational black woman. These are all used to control and to dehumanize black women, and this came out of essentially widespread white rape. So we need to recognize this. We try to dumb this down, but we need to be honest about this, because there are direct effects of this happening today. including, things like colonialism. A lot of, a lot of these colonial people, these enslavers, when they, would rape these black women, enslaved women, and then they would, have children, they would keep those children enslaved, as profit, but they would have lighter skin, and then they would often be treated better, so they were creating these hierarchy, like the lighter skin black people were better, and the darker skin were more black-like and were worse, and that created this colonialism that's still a powerful, a powerful internalization that, a powerful stereotype that we see, everywhere, even in Black communities. So we have to understand that that is all centered around this idea that we have to at least acknowledge that these people were rapists. Our founding fathers were, particularly Thomas Jefferson was a rapist, and we need to be honest about that so we can be, honestly deal with the outcomes of that. And just to show you how little Black women had control over their bodies and reproductive systems is when they did have babies. Oftentimes, if it coincided with a white woman having a baby, they would take the Black babies from their mothers and force the white force them to breastfeed the white babies, because this is it was at the time, because of this new emergence of patriarchy that we talk about with the rise of capitalism, created women as these delicate things that couldn't be involved with such nasty things like breastfeeding, and so they created enslaved wet nurses, that Black women, enslaved women would breastfeed white babies, but at the same time, there was no breast milk for their own babies, so they had to use a mixture of cow's milk and dirty water, and it created horrific mortality rates as well. And that legacy is directly affected because we know right today that babies that breastfeed are healthier and more likely to survive. So but we don't knowledge why, because right now Black women have the lowest levels of all racial groups of breastfeeding, and we don't acknowledge the history behind that. We just kind of shame that, when in reality that's directly linked to this this trauma, this horrific trauma around breastfeeding during that Black women experience and continue to experience even after slavery. Black wet nurses continued after, because it was more horrific economic conditions that forced them to become wet nurses, but this continued beyond slavery. And that is a direct result why we have lower levels of Black women breastfeeding. But then we have all these white people that don't understand this history, and then just start doing these campaigns shaming Black women for the lack of, and that's we need to understand this history, and we need to recognize this history if we want to kind of separate people from from historic trauma. Because that's what's we want to get better Black breastfeeding statistics, we need to recognize this trauma and separate breastfeeding from the trauma, but that's a whole nother thing that we're going to talk about this in another class as well. So, and then we start seeing this emergence in Virginia. Not only were they selling all their enslaved people they already owned down the river, but they were also creating these basically what they called breeding farms or breeding industries. They were rape farms. And this, this came about, we talked a little bit about this, it came about because of Article 1, Section 9, Constitution that said they were going to outlaw international slave trade, but in 20 years. But like I said, most states have already outlawed it because they knew it was very profitable. Their slaves are more valuable when they outlawed it. It was basically practicing trade protectionism. But it was that for some reason South Carolina did not, kept on, participating in international slave trade. So that's when Thomas Jefferson had to step in and actually passed the act that banned international slave trade. And we give him all this credit. Oh, you did so, that's such an abolitionist thing to do. But it had nothing to do with abolition. It was about creating trade protectionism. It's William Spivey writes some really great articles about the American breeding farms. He wrote that the South was producing and selling enough slaves internally that the slave trade was reducing prices for slaves and cutting into profits. And then there's another book's quote says, Virginia slave owners won a major victory when Thomas Jefferson's 1808 prohibition of the African slave trade protected the domestic slave markets for slave breeding. And when we read this quote from William Spivey, it talks about these slave breeding farms that emerged. Most of us are aware that slave owners often breed their slaves to produce more workers. We are taught almost nothing about breeding farms whose function was to produce as many slaves as possible for the sale and distribution throughout the South to meet their needs. Two of the largest breeding farms were located in Richmond, Virginia, and Maryland Eastern Shore. The slave population of the breeding farms were mostly women and children not old enough to be sold, and a limited number of men whose job was to impregnate as many slave women as possible. The slaves were often given hoods or bags over their heads to keep them from knowing who they were having forced sex with. It could be someone they know, perhaps a niece, aunt, sister, or their own mother. The breeders only wanted a child that could be sold. So you can imagine like just the horrific, horrible conditions. And we talk about, we like to oftentimes, talk about how all this like horrible racist stuff was only happening from these ignorant, dumb racists, but in reality, I mean, this was calculated. These were capitalists. These were capitalists that were trying to make as much money as possible from commodifying people. But this is the same capitalism that we have today is the same one that drove this. So this wasn't just like the work of some ignorant people. These were calculated, investors and capitalists who was creating these industries of just horrific harm. So then we had this massive expansion in the 1800s, starting from 1800 up to 1860. Basically, America, United States becomes the cotton empire of the world at this point. And you can see these statistics where, we're, 1791, we were, these are in millions. We were making 200 million pounds of cotton, which was, the world was making 469, and we are just 0.01% of the world, and 0.01% of Britain, who was using most of the cotton in their industrial evolution. But all the way, we see these numbers just explode to the point that 1850s and 1860s we're producing 1,000 million, which because it's billion, like a billion, pounds of cotton. We're making it's times, getting close to outpacing the rest of the world, production. A lot of this came from India and different sources, but I mean, and then we, the share of the world production, we were the largest producer, starting in 1840s. We dominated the markets, and including Britain's markets. At the one point in 1851, we were like supplying just about all the cotton used in Britain or imported. So this is a percentage. And then at the same time, we were, we're just making an enormous amount of money at the same time. We're seeing this explosion of enslaved people from 1790. We had 800,000 all the way up to 4 million and 60 years later. And that's a direct result. That was after we banned international slavery. So this was all from, there was natural reproduction, but a lot of this was unnatural reproduction, was these slave farms. And you just see the enormous amount of wealth that's just coming out of this. I want to read this quote from Edward Baptiste that just talks about, what's happening in the 50 years before the Civil War. The amount of cotton the South grew increased almost every single year from 1800, when enslaved African Americans made 1.4 million pounds of cotton, to 1860, when they harvested almost 2 billion pounds. 80% of all cotton grown in the United States was exported across the Atlantic, almost all of it to Britain. Cotton was the most important raw material in the Industrial Revolution that created our modern world economy. I just want to reiterate that cotton was the most important raw material of the Industrial Revolution that created our modern world economy. So when we talk about, we often teach that slavery was this like, side thing, while all these other things, Industrial Revolution and everything was happening. None of that really could have happened, at least not on the level that it did, without slavery. So by 1820, the ability of enslaved people in southwestern frontier fields to produce more cotton of higher quality for less drove most other producing regions out of the world market. Enslaved African Americans were the world's most efficient producers of cotton, and they got more efficient every year, which also comes in like another myth that we try to sell is like slavery wasn't that efficient, wasn't as efficient as free wages. Once we perfected, certain forms of torture, it became the most efficient form of labor in the world. And we're going to talk about how they got to that point. So a lot of these, so these factors behind this expansion of slavery, we talked about a bunch of these already. Tobacco was, prices were plummeting. Tobacco farms were being less, efficient. The fertility of the soil was dying. So it was, some people by 1780s, people were like, is slavery going to, even survive? But then, by 1800s, they're like, yeah, it's going to survive and become the biggest economic factor of the world, essentially. So it came with a cotton gin that allowed, basically opened up where you can grow as much as possible with no processing limitation. And then the domestic slave trade, blew up this, the domestic trade, once we banned international trade, we had trade protectionism. We created this, to the point where basically at this point, the most valuable parts of slavery, was producing more slaves, beyond, things like cotton. And that, I'll read this quote by Jason Cote. By a conservative estimate in 1860, the total value of American slaves was $4 billion, far more than gold and silver than circulating nationally, 228 million, most of it in the North. Total currency 435 million. So that's saying not only the gold and silver, but the total currency in the world was even, a quarter of the value of slaves. And even the value of the South's total farmland, which was 1.2 billion, didn't even come halfway close to the value of enslaved people. Slaves were to slavers worth more than everything else they could imagine combined. The legal, so that's important to understand, because this is a billion-dollar industry of producing slaves, not even including, like, we're not talking about the raw materials they create. We're not talking about cotton or sugar or tobacco. We're talking just the value in itself of reproducing, slaves through these like slave breeding industries was a $4 billion industry. And then on top of that, we acquired Louisiana Purchase. We got that from France, for Napoleon, after he was beat it after the Haitian Revolution, the slave revolution. He was done with his empire and sold, 500 million acres, and it was like super cheap, and they were able to go back and then sell that to new plantation owners, for super cheap as well. And same with Indian Removal Act, as in their 25 million acres in the South that opened up. And the United States solved this land shortage by expropriating millions of acres from Native Americans, often with military force, acquiring Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Florida. They then sold that land on cheap, just $1.25 an acre in the early 1830s, which is today's $38 to white settlers. So literally, I mean, they can, buy today's value. Imagine going out and buying, 100 acres at $38 an acre. I mean, that's unheard of. But that's how much, that's why it was so easy for so many people to start this. It wasn't just a thing for the rich. And then what really solidified it, this expansion, was these two systems: the slave mortgages and the systems of torture. So slave mortgages. There was these new banks that were now lending, credit and helping people, buy enslaved people, buy land. And particularly if you already owned an enslaved person, that was what we call, you could really expand quickly with these new banks and these new lines of credit, because you can get what's called a slave mortgage. This was the first mortgage. This is like hundreds of years before we have a home mortgage system. It's essentially, slave mortgages where you can use, an enslaved person as a collateral, and then you can get a whole bunch more, credit to buy more enslaved people and more land. And people used that at the time to basically, open up huge plantations with huge number of enslaved people in the Mississippi Valley and these new areas where, indigenous people were ethnically cleansed. And then on top of that, we created, the U.S. created its first, bond market, which was basically taking these mortgages and then sending them out all over the world as bonds that people can, invest into. So like London and Amsterdam and Paris, this is like, even after they outlawed slavery, they were investing, huge amount of money into these bond markets, and that ultimately ended up being an enormous amount of credit that was extended to new, slave plantations. where they could, and so a lot of people were going in debt to start this, but it was such a profitable system that they would get out of debt super quickly. But eventually, it did create a bubble. I think it was like in the 1830s and 40s that popped, and the international bond market kind of collapsed. And instead of holding people accountable, they kind of just closed off the international market and allowed local plantation people in debt to continue doing what they're doing. And then it wasn't very harmful for slave plantations, but it was, eventually it kind of destroyed the international market. But I mean, there's definitely, I got 30 or 40 years of just international funds just being pumped into expanding these markets. And then, but what really, made this possible was what we call the pushing system, which is this very sophisticated system of torture. This was something that wasn't just like one plantation came up with it. I mean, they would share these, best practices in magazines and have conferences and things. And I mean, these were practices that were shared throughout. But essentially, they created these sophisticated systems of measurement where they basically gave everyone a daily quota, every enslaved person, and whoever didn't make that would be tortured, often by the whip, but there was all kinds of different types of torture out there. And there was, I mean, some of these, I'm not going to get into the details, but some of the stories are just, sadistic as heck, like it's just like the level of torture that went into torturing, enslaved people. We often talk about, like the Spanish Inquisition and all these other, foreign things that tortured people, but nothing like, how we tortured enslaved people for production. That was a new high for or new low, I guess, for America. And so this is a myth that, paid labor was more efficient. Thomas Jefferson talked about it. And I think that's important, that myth, is often, they try to downplay how much actual money was created from these industries, even today, because we downplay this as like, oh, slavery happened a long time ago. It didn't make that much money. It wasn't that significant, when in reality, it made an insane amount of money, more than anything else in this country. It created the United States. It created the Industrial Revolution. It created all of this, like, and it created an enormous amount of wealth. And we need to recognize that. A lot of people are worried about recognizing that because they're afraid it's going to end up with reparations, which, yes, it should. But that's one of the reasons why we downplay this, to try to avoid any kind of talk about reparations. But I want to read the source of the ever-rising productivity wasn't a machine like the ones that was crucial to the textile mills. In fact, you could say that business of the new cotton technology was a whip. And they even talk about, I mean, a lot of these, these plantations, the first like factory systems, like these organized, delegations, these organized systems of delegations and responsibilities, were used eventually in factories and all this. I mean, this isn't just like, oh, we just tortured people that were slow. We just whipped people that were, this was a very sophisticated system that basically, just to read this, hard forced labor multiplied U.S. cotton production to 130 times its 1800 level by 1860. So that means, in the 60 years between 1800 and 1860, the average enslaved person was picking 130 times more cotton than what they started. And that was purely by, torture. That was 100% by torture, but systematic and measured torture. It was a pretty horrific situation. And we don't talk that much about it. We don't, like, economic classes. I really like this Edward Baptiste quote. He says, we don't usually see torture as a factor of production. Economic teachers don't put in on the chalkboard as a variable in the graph, like T stands for torture, one component of S or supply. But here's something that may help reveal how crucial systemized torture was in the Industrial Revolution and thus the birth of the modern world. And I think that says so much that, when we talk about this, this top-down approach on the economic level, we don't even mention torture as a factor. But that was a big factor on the creation of this U.S. and the wealth and all the things that we're talking about, came down to how well we could torture, laborers, enslaved laborers. So I'm going to read this. This is another, Matthew Desmond wrote 1619 Project, another article, one of like the dozen articles written. And this, read this entire article. It's so well, it's one of the better ones. It's called, In Order to Understand the Brutality of American Capitalism, You Have to Start on the Plantation. So there is some comfort, I think, in attributing the sheer brutality of slavery to dumb racism. We imagine pain being inflicted somewhat at random, doled out by a stereotypical white overseer, free but poor. But a good many overseers weren't allowed to whip at will. Punishments were authorized by higher ups. It was not so much the rage of a poor white Southerner, but the greed of a rich white planter that drove the lash. The violence was neither arbitrary nor gratuitous. It was rational, capitalistic, all part of its plantation design. Each individual having a stated number of pounds of cotton to pick. The formerly enslaved worker Henry Watson wrote in 1848, the deficient of which was made up by as many lashes being applied to the poor slave's back. Because overseers closely monitored enslaved workers' picking abilities, they assigned each worker a unique quota. Falling short of that quota could get you beaten, but overshooting your target could bring misery the next day because the master might respond by raising your picking rate. Profits from the heightened productivity were harnessed through the anguish of enslaved. This was why the fastest cotton pickers were often whipped the most. It was why punishments rose and fell with global market fluctuations. Speaking of cotton, in 1854, the fugitive slave John Brown remembered when the price rises in the English market, the poor slave immediately feels the effects, for they are harder driven, and the whip is kept more constantly going. Unrestrained capitalism holds no monopoly on violence, but in making possible the pursuit of near limitless personal fortunes, often at someone else's expense, it does put a cash value on our moral commitments. So that's so important to understand, because again, we try to sell all these horrific things that are happening in slavery as like just a bunch of dumb racists, that didn't know better, and they're just like, and we see this in a lot of movies, like overseers or these like drunk people, Irish people that are just angry and like ignorant and like all kinds of stereotypes. And reality, I mean, that was not the case. This was like this is a very sophisticated system of torture. That was this was capitalism. Capitalism was created to make wealth from exploiting labor, and they just perfected this system of capitalism through slavery. They perfected the exploitation of labor through torture, through systematic and measured torture. So that's really important to understand. Because we're still living in this capitalist system, and it's still producing profit off of exploitation. One thing I want to talk about a little bit is we often talk about cotton. We're the cotton empire, but we don't talk too much about what we call white gold, which is sugar plantations, and that's we try to reserve that for something that that was done in the Caribbean and West Indies and Brazil, but not here. Mainly because it was one of the most brutal systems of plantation of slavery. And so sugar was this luxury back in the early colonial days. It was Columbus's second voyage where he actually brought sugar stalks from the Spanish Canary Islands. I want to say they're all like off the coast of like western northern Africa somewhere, and he brought those to the West Indies basically, and at the time, and it was considered a luxury because it was so hard to produce. Just like actually processing cotton. I mean, these things would just shred you up. The leaves were like razor sharp, and then actually processing it in the factory, they had to boil it down to molasses and like all kinds of horrific worker conditions. People lost their limbs, their lives. It was a horrific situation. And that, so it was really hard to find people to work on that. But, European colonialism solved that problem by essentially, killing off all the indigenous people, taking their land, planting sugar plantations, and then using enslaved Africans to kind of do all this horrific labor. And that's why it's so different. Like why the international slave trade, stayed open for, why so many millions of slaves, more went to like Brazil and West Indies. That's because they weren't interested in actually keeping the enslaved person alive and doing, breeding them and things like that. They were just interested in producing as much profit. So they just worked these people to death. Some of them, some life expectancies were like 3 years, 3 to 7 years was like the general for a lot of them. It was pretty horrific, and they would just buy more because it was so profitable. essentially, once we opened up the Louisiana Purchase, we started United States, or at least early colonial United States, started looking at sugar plantations. So it was the United States actually in the 1800s, and they started starting their own sugar plantations in down the deep South, and mainly in Louisiana Territory along the Mississippi River. And it was the same horrific situation. Child labor, sugar refineries were saying open night and day. People had to work nonstop, horrific hours, high mortality and injury rates, and torture used to increase efficiencies. And again, these torture, these are just sadists, all these techniques that I was reading about all the different torture techniques. I'm not going to repeat them, but they're really horrific. But that was to increase the production. But I want to read this, another 1619 article. Khaled Gibran Muhammad wrote, "The sugar that saturates the American diet has a barbaric history as the white gold that fueled slavery." So within 5 decades, Louisiana planters were producing 1/4 of the world's cane sugar supply. During antebellum reign, Queen Sugar bested King Cotton locally, making Louisiana the 2nd richest state in the per capita wealth. According to the historian Richard Follett, the state ranked 3rd in banking behind New York and Massachusetts in 1840. The value of enslaved people alone represented tens of millions of dollars in capital that financed investments, loans, and businesses. Much of that investment fueled back into sugar mills, most industrialized sector of the Southern economy, an enormous market in enslaved laborers who had no way to opt out the treacherous work. So we often talk about how the South grew cotton and raw materials and then sent it to the North to process in factories, and that happened for a lot of things like cotton, but for sugar, the industries were actually in the South. This was one of the few industrialized sectors of their economy was the sugar industries. And again, they because of the slave mortgages and slave credit, they used the value of their slaves to get more capital to reinvest and build this system that basically provided 1/4 of the world's sugar markets. And then afterwards, after slavery ended, the same thing that happened with cotton that we'll talk about later is you had sharecropping and vagrancy laws and convict leasing, and basically forcing people to continue to be enslaved on these cotton plantations under new names. It wasn't called slavery, but it was still slavery. That still happened in the sugar plantations. I'm gonna read this last quote that talked about a little bit about that. From slavery to freedom, many Black Louisianans found that the crushing work of sugarcane remained mostly the same. Even with Reconstruction delivering civil rights for the first time, white planters continued to dominate land ownership. Freedmen and freedwomen had little choice but to live in somebody's old slave quarters. And new wage earners, they negotiated the best terms they could, signed labor contracts for up to a year, and moved frequently from one plantation to another in search of a life whose daily rhythm beats differently than just before. And yet, even compared with sharecropping on cotton plantations, Rogers said sugar plantations did a better job preserving racial hierarchy. As a rule, the historian John C. Rodriguez writes, plantation labor overshadowed Black people's lives in sugar region until well into the 20th century. So they're talking about how it was still, it was so horrific even afterwards. I mean, people were forced into these sharecropping, but basically sharecropping in these sugar plantations, and they're again horrific conditions, and that lasted well into the early 1900s. So the author actually makes this really good point that that's one of the major reasons why we're seeing such horrific health public health issues is sugar. Sugar's in everything, and it's responsible for so many dietary issues and health problems, and so the author even makes that connection. Without the institution of slavery, we would sugar wouldn't be this commodity found in everything as it is now, because slavery actually just created made sugar a non-luxury item and made it just something that could be exported around the world, and it created cultures around food cultures around this. So we're going to talk more about how colonialism affected our food systems during our food justice class as well. So another important thing to understand about, and we talked a little bit about this already. We actually talked a lot about this during our whiteness class in our second class, but I just want to kind of go over this, in case you didn't watch that class, and we'll add a little bit more, to it. But one of the most important aspects, of slavery, to know about is the fact that slavery, the transatlantic slave system, American slavery created racism. It created the idea of races. First, it created black people, in Africa, to justify that, that we were bringing, we were enslaving them and treating them horribly because we were bringing civilization and Christianity because they were all inferior people, inferior species. So that was one side of the coin, but eventually we created this idea of white people, which we created in the 1700s, and that was, or the late 1600s in Virginia. And that, basically, that it came about what we call the racial bribe. So the racial bribe is essentially, it's giving, it's trying to figure out, it's trying to divide poor white people, working white people, and poor black, enslaved and working and free black people. So there was this fear, mainly because there was a lot of rebellions, because it's such horrific conditions. Even if you're an indentured servant or enslaved, it was a pretty horrific for both. So there was all these rebellions against colonial, elites and colonial governments and against these plantation systems. Lots of them, but the biggest one would be in Bacon's Rebellion, which is, Bacon, basically rallied, enslaved black people, indentured white people, or Europeans, they were called. White wasn't invented yet. And then they, they basically rallied and they attacked Jamestown and burned down Jamestown, the colonial government in Virginia at the time. And it scared a lot of colonial governments. They had to bring a whole army in from Britain to put down this rebellion. So they wanted to figure out this new way to kind of divide those two, to keep these poor people from uniting again. So they created what was called the racial bribe, which is basically they gave all these benefits to indentured servants, white European indentured servants, and then they gave all these horrific conditions such as permanent slavery and racialized slavery and hereditary slavery to black people, with the idea that with that new racial divide, that poor white people, because they're getting a little bit, even though they're still really oppressed, they're still getting a little bit, and they're doing better than the black people, so they're going to find more in common now with these rich white people on top, and this and that's what's going to create this this racial divide and this idea of racism. Michelle Alexander from the new Jim Crow talks about deliberately and strategically the planter class extended special privileges to poor whites in an effort to drive a wedge between them and black slaves. White settlers were allowed greater access to Native American lands. White servants were allowed to police slaves through slave patrols and militias. We're going to talk more about this, but this is the foundation of our police systems was the idea of white people being able to slave patrol black enslaved people. The barriers were created so that free labor would not be placed in competition with slave labor. These measures effectively eliminated the risk of future alliances between black slaves and poor whites. So essentially, what they codified a lot of these in these new legislating laws and slave codes, which basically with all the merchants of Virginia created their own slave codes in 1705, and then all the other colonial states did their own version, was basically a copy of Virginia, and it basically enshrined. Before then, there wasn't a whole lot of laws around slavery, but this basically was the first, my understanding, it was like the first legal institutionalized, law around slavery, where they basically said all black people were property, and then their children, and children's children were property as well, and white people could torture, rape, kill, they can, all do whatever they want with these black people. And even freed white people at a time that were able to, buy their freedom, it still removed all their rights, right to vote, right to do, all different kinds of things. So it made it pretty horrific for black people. And then at the same time, we start seeing, and you see all these benefits for white people, being extended to them. And then this is the first time we actually see the word white come about. Before then, Europeans were called Europeans or British or Christians, but now this is what we create, this new word, particularly in 1691, where it creates this new law that basically bans black and white people getting married, so this is the first time we see this idea, the word white, come about in an actual legal document. And this is officially what creates this white people as this like legalized, racial hierarchy, where to be white, you had, all these benefits from, land and protection. You could participate in slave patrols, and you can militias, and you can own weapons, and you could do, can hunt and all this stuff. To be black, you're enslaved, or you're free without any rights. And that's ultimately where we create, the idea of whiteness, and where it's like, and merge it with this anti-blackness, racism. To be white was basically to be not black. And it really had little to do with the color of your skin, because there was all these new people, like Irish and Jewish people that came about that they weren't considered white. Like officially on legal documents, they were not considered white. On census reports, they weren't, until they had to assimilate and basically adopt anti-black culture to become white eventually. And the same with black people. There was these laws like one drop laws, where if you had one ancestor a long time ago that was black, and everyone else was white, you were, and your skin was white, you're still considered black in many states. So this had very little to do with color of skin. It was all a legalized racial hierarchy. And I want to read these two quotes really quickly that kind of help, bring a little bit more context to this. Because this is from Paul Kibble. Because Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans even worked and lived together in similar circumstances of servitude, and resisted and rebelled together against the way they were treated, the landowning class began to implement policies to separate European workers from African and Native American workers. Even in this early colonial period, racism was used to divide workers and make it easier for those in power to control working conditions. Drawing on already established popular classifications, whiteness, now somewhat separate from Christianity, was delineated more clearly as a legal category in the United States in the 17th century. And the concept of lifelong servitude, slavery, was introduced from the West Indies and distinguished from various forms of shorter life term servitude, indentured. In response, Bacon's rebellion and other rebellions in the ruling class, especially in the populous and dominant territory of Virginia, began to establish a clear racial hierarchy in the 1660s and 70s. By the 1730s, racial divisions were firmly in place legally and socially. Most blacks were enslaved, and even free blacks had lost the right to vote, the right to bear arms, and the right to bear witness. So that means like the right to be, participate in court systems and blacks were also barred from participating in many trades during this period. Meanwhile, whites had gained the right to corn, money, a gun, clothing, and 50 acres of land at the end of their indentureship. They could no longer be beaten naked and had the poll tax reduced. In other words, poor whites gained legal, political, emotional, social, and financial status that was directly related to the competent degradation of Indians and Negroes. And the last one, this is Matthew Desmond again from the 1619 Project, wrote, slavery did supplement white workers with what W.D. Du Bois called a public and psychological wage, which allowed them to roam freely and feel the sense of entitlement. But this too served the interest of money. Slavery pulled down all workers' wages, both in the cities and countryside. Employers had access to a large and flexible labor pool made up of enslaved people and free people. This not only created a starkly uneven playing field, dividing workers from themselves, it also made all non-slavery appear as freedom. Witnessing the horrors of slavery drilled into poor white workers that things could be worse. So they generally accepted their lot, and American freedom became broadly defined as the opposite of bondage. So I really like that that last quote, and how it just captured this idea that even freed white people, poor white people, and or indentured servants white people were living horrific lives. But they were sold this idea that of freedom that was basically like, at least you're not enslaved, at least you're not an enslaved black person. And that was enough for many white people to stop rebelling and accept this reality that they're living in, the same reality that was forced upon them in the 14, 15, 1600s in Europe, during the rise of capitalism, as they're, forced into work in horrific, factory conditions and forced off common lands. So they, in America, US, they accepted this because they didn't want to be like, black enslaved people. There's this great quote, Lyndon B. Johnson said this, and I think it captures this, even though this was like 200 years later or something like that. But he said, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down upon, and he'll empty his pockets for you. I think that just that captures it so perfectly of this like racial bribe, and how they created this class system that was horrific to all people, but lower class white people accepted it because at least they weren't enslaved. Was basically. I'm going to play this quick video about Ordinance of Everything. They talk a little bit more about these racist laws that were established. This is a really great video that you should watch the whole video, but we're just going to focus on the colonial time period.
Which brings us to our first stop in the history of legal discrimination in the United States: colonialism and slavery. After colonies were established in North America, colonists were subject to the laws and customs of England. In their essay Situating Colonialism, Race, and Punishment, Professors Gita Chowdhury and Mark Beeman explain how the development of slavery in the North American colonies, and later in the early United States, became dependent on the passage of discriminatory laws that specifically targeted people of African descent. They detail how, although the concept of discrimination based on ethnic or social groups dates back to antiquity, the idea that race was entirely based on skin tone and physical features evolved alongside the emergence of chattel slavery. Then the ideal was solidified with the emergence of scientific racism in the 18th and 19th centuries. Chowdhury and Beeman go on to note that although some of the original people of African descent who entered the English colonies came as indentured servants and were eventually set free, similar to English indentured servants, this quickly changed when colonists turned to chattel slavery as a source of consistent, exploited, and unpaid labor. They write, "In other words, slavery seems to have evolved in part as a punishment reserved for Africans originally indentured. English indentured servants, presumably protected by English rights and the Christianity they shared with their masters, avoided such punishment. From the 1640s through the 1660s, with the principle of lifelong involuntary servitude established for Africans in colonial America, individual colonies began enacting legislation declaring Negroes sent to the colonies and their offspring slaves for life. In short, slavery in British colonial America became a punishment for being Black." With this important distinction, colonial America created the system of chattel slavery that sentenced Black people to perpetual servitude. Slavery created an explicit relationship between race and the law from the earliest foundations of American society. And this new legal category meant that new forms of punishment and torture were invented to accommodate this shift in who could be considered a full person under the law. Soon, laws and colonial codes were written to regulate the control and punishment of the enslaved. Although slavery was not the first instance of race being tied to laws in the new colonies, the colonization of land in North America was based on the assumption that Native Americans did not have rights to the land they had inhabited long before settler colonialism declared North America as uninhabited. Therefore, laws that allowed white settlers to displace and physically harm Native Americans also established an early relationship between race and the law in colonial America. While most punishment was left up to slave owners and could include torture, brutal beatings, rape, and other inhumane cruelties, more serious punishment, such as execution, was sometimes left up to the discretion of judges for supposed offenses that occurred away from the plantation. But whether it was being dealt by overseers and owners or by the state, the result was a system of exploitation and legally supported subjugation that left Black subjects almost entirely outside of the protections of the law. This system remained firmly in place in parts of the United States until 1865, with the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But even these newly won freedoms could not guarantee the continuation of legal and extra-legal methods of racial and social control.
All right, definitely check out this. They do. This is just one section of a larger video that talks about the racist origins of a lot of U.S. laws. So definitely check out this whole thing. So now we get to the American Revolution, and we typically, we're taught, one main reason why we went to war. And I mean, this reason was true, but in reality, it was one of many reasons why we had a Revolutionary War. But the main reason we're taught is taxation without representation. That particularly around, Britain, especially after the French and Indian War, they had, all these costs. They had a standing army. And essentially, like if you look at the taxation of white colonialists at the time compared to like British citizens, like British were paying an enormous amount of taxes, and a lot of that went to like funding a standing British army that protected the colonial colonial people from France or Native Americans, and not to Yeah, not to say that British wasn't like also super oppressive, but at the same time, I mean, we oversell this like all these like taxes that were being forced on them. A lot of these taxes were paying for their protection against and paying for the standing army, and it still even didn't even come close to how much the average British citizen was paying. So we kind of over exaggerate a little bit about these taxations, but but I think what is even more true, what is more real, is like when we try to resist these things, and Britain empire often met this with harsh responses, to like when they would massacre people protesting different laws. They would shut down Boston, and so that really was what galvanized a lot of the North. But that was mainly happening in the North, and the South wasn't too on board with like doing a whole war against this huge empire. It took some other reasons to get the South on board, because they were not on board at first. And there was a lot of people in the North about revolutionary, about creating new democracies and all that stuff. So that was true too. But the South wasn't so much interested in that. Well, a big thing what they're interested in was protecting slavery, and a big part is because there was a chance that Britain was going to outlaw slavery very soon, and that really started with the Somerset case in 1772, which basically was a court case that basically found that common English law does not support slavery at all, which is very convenient, to find that out, hundreds of years after, European colonialism. But I mean, I guess at least they found that out, and with that law, they eventually, they freed all the slaves and enslaved people in England, and then that set the stage for eventually the emancipation of their entire empire, ranging from India all the way to the United States, I believe at this time they're one of the largest empires in the world. But the thing is, it's like that. There's certain, but they didn't specifically say they were going to outlaw slavery in the United States. But there was two things that made it pretty clear it was happening. One is these repugnancy clauses, which basically states that British charters that created colonies basically state that Americans cannot make legislation that was contrary to British law. So if British laws outlaw slavery, America can't make laws, legalizing slavery. And then the Declaratory Act of 1766 that Britain passed, which basically gave British Parliament power over all cases whatsoever involving American law. So that means, like, at the time, they saw a lot of American slaves were after the Somerset case were actually petitioning, the British government, for the freedom. So this really scared the South pretty bad, and it says a lot. This happened in 1772. Southern colonies were not on board with the Northern, Revolution, war, or resistance against English rule. But by 1774, at the First Continental Congress, John Adams basically promises Southern leaders that if they fight with him and join them, they will create a country that will maintain slavery. And we see this in every document that's produced afterwards. Even though, there was a lot of people wanting to outlaw slavery in the North, and there was a push, but ultimately they couldn't negotiate that, so they settled for basically preserving slavery in all their documents in order to bring the South on board with their war. So in Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, Constitution, all had wording. Oftentimes they wouldn't mention slavery, but it all had wordings that protected slavery, and protected private property, and all, had fugitive slave acts, things like that. So after that, after all these promises were being made that the slavery would be protected, when at the same time they were looking at Britain, and they were looking at, like, and rightly so, Britain, it took a little bit longer than they thought, but eventually, by the early 1800s, Britain would have outlawed slavery in the U.S. So particularly by 1833, it would have been outlawed. They don't know that for sure at the time, but they couldn't make that. They made a pretty good guess that it was coming, based on all the things that were happening. So that's when they decided, all of a sudden, after, Somerset case, after First Continental Congress promised to protect slavery, all of a sudden the South is completely on board with going to war, with its massive empire. So I like this quote: taxation might have been taken some of their property, but Somerset threatened to take it all. And that's really what's true. I mean, like, there, remember at the time, I mean, this, this was before the cotton explosion. So, but I mean, this was still a hugely profitable industry. Most of the wealth was tied into some type of slavery, whether actual owning slaves or working in industries that worked with slave material and enslaved material. So that was a huge point. And another one that we don't ever talk about was a Western expansion or the right to continue settler colonialism. And that was, after the really brutal French and Indian War against Britain and France and numerous different tribes on both sides, indigenous tribes, Britain basically passed the proclamation of 1763 that, basically said that the Appalachian Mountains was as far as colonialism was allowed to go. And that extended from, the bottom of the U.S., the bottom of, Georgia or whatever, all the way up to Canada. And actually Canada still, that's still a law in Canada. And that's actually where a lot of Canadian indigenous tribes are able to, get legal precedent to, that they use to, establish a lot of rights to land using that proclamation. But with the Revolutionary War, that proclamation for at least the United States was void at that point. And that's really important because that angered not only a lot of colonial. We often talk about it's mainly colonial settlers. It's like these individual people that just want to go out and create these to the frontier and create frontier plantations and stuff. But reality was this really angered the colonial elites. Because the colonial elites were very invested in land speculation, with the idea that they were eventually, they invested in these land speculation properties around indigenous land with the thought that eventually we're going to kill all these Indians, native people, and take their land. That was their assumption, and they were super mad with this 1763. I mean, this was like a little over 10 years, before the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence. So they were super mad at this point. And I just want to read this quote by Jeffrey Alster that really, summarizes what's happening. Although the reference to the merciless Indian savages, this is actually how we talked about indigenous people in our Declaration of Independence, appealed to the inhabitants of the frontiers, Jefferson and others who signed the Declaration had their own reasons for detesting British policies relating to Native Americans and their land. More than a decade earlier, in order to end a costly war to suppress indigenous resistance movement led by the Ottawa War leader Pontiac, the king issued the Proclamation of 1763, which recognized indigenous ownership of lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, crest, and prevented colonialists from settling there. At first glance, ordinary settlers might be expected to be been the proclamation's major opponents. Some settlers did object, but the most potent source of opposition came from the colonial elites, especially in Virginia and Pennsylvania, who invested in companies with claims to lands west of the boundaries set by the proclamation. Unless these lands could be legally settled, land companies could not secure title to their claims. Investors would be left out with nothing but debt they had incurred on the bet on getting rich. In 1767, George Washington, one of the area's most passionate land speculators, predicted that the proclamation must fall in a few years. And surely, I mean, it did, with the Declaration of Independence, that was, just a couple years later, a little less than 10 years later, it did. From 1776 to 1783, U.S. troops, so this is right after the Declaration, we immediately start ethnically cleansing indigenous people, essentially. From 1776 to 1783, U.S. troops and colonial militias destroyed more than 70 Cherokee towns, 50 Haudenosaunee towns, and at least 10 multi-ethnic towns in Ohio Valley, killing several hundred people, including civilians, and subjecting refugees to starvation, disease, and death. In the decades to come, U.S. Presidents Washington and Jefferson included would call for extermination of Native Americans who fought against this position. Several U.S. armies would try to do precisely that. It's really important to understand, like, the first legislation that we created, it wasn't the Constitution, it was the Northwest Ordinance, which is basically, it was a blueprint on how we basically ethnically cleanse Native Americans and take their land out west. And that was, beyond the Appalachian Mountain. So that, that just tells a lot. So I think, it's really like looking at all these reasons, especially looking how little the colonialists were actually taxed. And yes, some of these taxes that they were being imposed were a big difference, but I I may be wrong, but I don't think they ever, were going to pay more than an average British citizen. So that's, not to say, that, and I do recognize that, when British resisted, or when the colonists resisted, there was a lot of violence from British government, and that definitely galvanized a lot of people in this idea of enlightenment and democracy and stuff. Definitely was one cause, but it's really hard to see how that was, if it wasn't for these other causes, protecting slavery and going westward, that we would even consider, during this Revolutionary War. But I mean, no one really knows, and there's been a lot of, especially with the 1619 Project. This is a major source of contention, at least among white, top-down historians, that they believe that this was all about liberty and creating democracy, which again, yes, I mean, for some of them people it definitely was, but for others this was just about making a lot of money, or at least preserving the money that you have already invested in either slaves or enslaved people, or either in your land speculation, plans that were cut short by the 1763 proclamation. So I really like this. Nicole Hannah-Jones, this is straight from the 1619 Project. It's not incidental that 10 of the nation's first 12 presidents were enslavers, and some might argue that this nation was founded not as a democracy, but a slaveocracy. So when we talk about slaveocracy, slaveocracy is also known as a plantocracy, is a ruling class political order or government composed of dominated by slave owners and plantation owners. And yes, there was a lot of founding fathers, so this is for the Declaration of Independence. Everyone that had a red dot is an enslaver. And yes, I mean, it's like 90% or whatever were behind that. And then our Constitution was a little bit better. There was actually some representation of non-enslavers, and people that actually opposed slavery. But they, ultimately, they wanted the South to become part of this new country so bad, in this new constitution, that they tried to negotiate. They tried to negotiate, banning slavery. The South wasn't even going to, even entertain that idea. So they came up with all these compromises that essentially gave an enormous amount of power to slave owners in exchange for or enslavers in exchange for the South coming on board to this new country. That in my aspect, that is a slaveocracy. When the leaders, when the people that have the most power in your country are slave states, that's a slaveocracy. So I want so there's a couple of things I'm talking about a little bit. So when the Constitution was very pro-slavery, even though it didn't even mention the word slave, but some of the things it did is it gave slaves a 3/5 of a person compromise. So that was one thing where that, normally, we created all these like democracy systems that were based on population, like a House of Representatives. You got the most, representatives based on your population. The more people, the more representation you had, and same with electoral college. The more people you had, the more electoral college votes you had for electing a president. So that because of that, southern states who had huge, enslaved populations, because shortly after, the revolution, I mean, there was legitimately a lot of abolition, movements happening that couldn't happen without the revolution. So I mean, a lot of northern states outlawed slavery, soon after the revolution. But in turn, that the southern states just expanded, and then for every new enslaved person, they got an additional 3/5 of a vote. That gave them an enormous amount of representation. They basically dominated our government and dominated writing laws and legislation and institutions, all to protect slavery. Up until they just basically the 1860s, when they lost some a lot of their domination, and that's when they decided to create a known country, because they had no interest in being a part of the country that they did not dominate, and that did not protect slavery. And like Thomas Jefferson would not have became president if it wasn't for all the additional votes, electoral college votes that came with the 3/5 compromise. He would have actually lost that election. And Thomas Jefferson did a huge amount of legislation protecting slavery, especially expanding domestic slave trade and exploring and colonizing the West. So, and then there's other parts, like we already talked about the article that prohibited, that basically outlawed Atlantic slave trade in 20 years. That even though it seems, abolitionist, that was pro-slavery. That was to, basically to create, make, domestic slavery a very profitable, system. They had a fugitive slave clauses. It was basically about, returning property. They never, again, they never mentioned the word slave, like, but they, it was all about, they often use words like property and things like that, but it was like there was many clauses that had to do with protecting slavery. It was yeah, like I said, 25 out of 55 delegates, who wrote the Constitution actually owned, were enslavers. The abolitionist William Garrison claimed that, Constitution was so pro-slavery that he called it a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. So this is our Constitution. This is the piece of document that we're basically sold as the being this greatest document in the world, and it's essentially like it's a slave document. I'm gonna read Edward Baptiste. But the Constitution was also built from timber of another bargain. In this one, major Southern and Northern power brokers forced their more reluctant colleagues to consent to both survival and expansion of slavery. The first point of debate in the compromise had been the issue of whether enslaved people should be counted in determined representation of the House. Representing Pennsylvania, Governor Morris warned that this would encourage the slave trade from Africa, since importing states would be rewarded with more clout in the national government. In the end, however, every northern state but one agreed that a slave could count as 3/5 of a person in allocating representation. The 3/5 compromise affected not only the House but also the presidency, since each state's number of electoral votes was to be determined by adding 2 for its senators and to its number of representatives in the House. One result was the South's dominance of the presidency over the next 70 years. 4 of the first 5 presidents would be Virginia slaveholders. 8 of the first dozen owned people. Over the long run, those presidents helped shape the nation's policies of geographic and economic growth around expansion of slavery. Not only that is like one of our first acts that we did, other than like, the Northwest Ordinance we did a naturalization act, like who can actually become a citizen, a naturalized citizen. Everyone at first was naturalized, but then it was really up to, when new people immigrating. And basically the Naturalization Act in 1798 stated that only white people, because white people was now a legal category, that only white people could be citizens and have the right to vote, own land, due process, all these different things. And it didn't really outline who had the right to vote. That was more of a state, thing up until, at first the Constitution didn't really say, who can vote and not vote. And actually some states in the North, Black people very briefly had a chance, right to vote, and white women as well. But all that was kind of outlawed as with the Naturalization Act and different other acts that basically said only white people at this point, white males and property owners for the most part were able to vote. And this was the first legal document in the U.S. that used the term white, as opposed, I know in colonial America, they started using the word white, but this was the first, United States document about white. And then we even see in the U.S. Census classifications, and we start seeing there's white people, and then there's free people of color and Black people. These are the only categories that we're starting to produce. So I'm going to read this last Edward Baptiste. From the 1790s, the continual increasing productivity of enslaved hands had generated the most important raw material in the world economy as a constantly declining real price. This had made Southern enslavers incredibly wealthy and powerful too. They were able to attract massive quantities of investment capital in the 1830s, and enslavers also exerted disproportionate influence over the national government, ensuring the creation and implementation of the policies that benefit them. So in my opinion, this is just opinion because it's not, we were totally established as a slaveocracy. We gave a huge amount of power to slave states, and basically allowed for slave owning states and slave owners, enslavers to dominate our government, and that may not have been what everyone wanted, but that's what happened, and that's what we need to recognize. Instead of talking about this these beauty, these ideas of democracy, enlightenment ideas, and all this stuff, this wonderful experiment that didn't happen. This is the reality that happened, and we need to recognize that because we're still dealing with this today. And the only people that argue, because of 1619 really argue this, that we are established as slaveocracy, and then there's a lot of white, top-down historians, not a lot, but a handful, these white organizations that are pushing back, saying this. And, they're not saying none of this didn't happen. They're just saying that these are important details to be teaching, that we should really focus on that. And that says a lot to the white supremacy that's in our history, that we need to get past. But again, I do want to mention, though, that the revolution did have anti-slavery results as well. The biggest one being after the revolution, we saw a lot of northern states start outlawing slavery. And they couldn't have done that if they would have been actually, they would have actually been forced to, by 1833. But they would all have to outlaw it, but eventually, but at the time, this allowed many northern states to outlaw it. And this is really, the freed enslaved people, the free black people, and a lot of the, this really created the emancipation movement in the North, that eventually pushed to, had a big hand in the Civil War and the freeing of enslaved, the dismantling of slavery. So that was, so you can make a loose case that there was certain parts that definitely helped the abolition, but for the most part, the establishment, the Constitution was very pro-slavery. This was mainly individual state efforts that against slavery. So, another big, myth, and hopefully people are seeing past this, is this idea that, we fought the Civil War for, lots of reasons, like the South, left because of states' rights, tariffs, lack of, economic, unequal exchanges and things like that. And that's just simply not true. I mean, not to say those things didn't happen, but that did not even factor into why, Southern states left. And that's clear. We know why they left, because they all wrote resolutions and declarations, and they all basically had words like, "We're leaving to protect the institution of African slavery. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. We want to, the beneficent and patriarchal system of African." They all talked about, slavery and white supremacy, and how the election of Lincoln, even though he was really, he didn't like slavery, but that was not a huge issue. I mean, I really doubt he would have abolished slavery if the South had left. He was mainly looking for these, gradual emancipations. He was looking for, compensation, but he wouldn't have forced it without the South leaving, in my opinion, and then a lot of other historian opinions as well. In reality, this is what kills me about states' rights, is actually Southern states really oppose states' rights. Particularly the rights of states of not enacting federal law, because at the time all federal law was very pro-slavery. Fugitive slave acts. You had all the Supreme Court passing Dred Scott and all these different cases supporting slavery, and it's a lot of northern states tried to pass state laws to get around that, try to find ways states' rights issues to not enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, and that ultimately the North made huge cases like they opposed states' rights. It really wasn't until up until the Civil War, they suddenly kind of, try to push this narrative that that they're the ones that that need states' rights. But if you really look at the history, they were definitely, they were very, very anti-states' rights, and that's because the federal government was very pro-slavery, and they didn't really become even concerned about states' rights until the federal government started leaning towards not going anti-slavery, just leaning towards slavery with Lincoln, or anti-slavery. And then it brings us to another point. Why did the Union fight? And that comes up. I want to go over this because I hear this from a lot of conservative commentaries when we start talking about things like reparations and things, and then they act like because white people, a lot of white people died and fought in the Civil War, that ultimately the end result freed slaves, that this this basically just washed the hands of all white people, and they were actually the heroes, because they're the only civilization that fought to free slavery. And the reality is it's not quite like that. That didn't happen. We'll just read this quote from Tyler D. Perry. He wrote, I'll zoom, get out of my way. Rush Limbaugh peddled similar, Rush Limbaugh peddled similar claims throughout Barack Obama's presidency, claiming that white people should feel no guilt about the institution since they led the movement to end slavery in the Western Hemisphere. Conservative commentator and author Ben Shapiro rejected the need for a national apology for slavery, contending that such an apology has already occurred with 700,000 Americans died during the Civil War, ignoring, of course, that this number includes the Confederates who died to preserve the institution. So about, a little less than half, or a little more than half, about 700,000 were Confederates. Ultimately, the myths of white saviorism are designed to alleviate white guilt. If white people are condemned for initiating the problem, they can still take credit for ending it. Conservatives have manipulated such narratives to appease a white voting base that denies it has any responsibility for or receives any benefits from this history. This story feeds an enduring sense of white grievance and encourages white voters to reject claims for social justice espoused by marginalized groups. So this rewriting of history is mainly just so we don't, to oppose any kind of social justice programs, from reparations to affirmative actions to anything that tries to, deal with the consequences of slavery that we're still dealing with today. And so we try to, they say, oh, well, we all, white people, fought and, to end the war, so we're all good. But no, to me that's just insane to think that white people benefited from centuries and centuries and for an enormous amount of wealth and destroying continents and creating industrial empires through slavery, and then there's a war that happens, and the bloodiest battle in the country, mainly because so many people, white people, fought to maintain slavery. They actually left the Union because they were worried about protecting slavery. And when you look at why did Lincoln and all these people sign up to fight on the North, Lincoln was honest about this. He said, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save a Union, and what I forbear because I do not believe it would be the help to save the Union. And then George A. Smith writes, although Lincoln sincerely detested slavery, he was no abolitionist. On contrary, he often criticized abolitionism as a threat to the Union and advocated instead a scheme of gradualism that included compensation for slaveholders and another policy that abolitionists opposed in resettling all blacks outside the United States. So we see, this is another contentious point with 1619. They talk about kind of the dark side of Lincoln and how he was not, he believed in white supremacy and the racial hierarchies. He believed black people were inferior. He wanted to export black people to African colonizations or African colonies like Liberia. He was a big advocate for that stuff because he blamed a lot of this stuff, a lot of these tensions on black people. And that's true. I still have an enormous amount of respect for Lincoln and for all the people that fought this war, but I have to understand, because I value the outcomes. I don't often value intentions. I value outcomes. What was the outcome? And the outcome was that slavery was abolished during this war. But we have to understand, too, at the same time that that was never really the desire of Lincoln or many of the people that pushed for this. He did the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all slaves in southern states, and then all the slaves that were still enslaved in border states, he did not free them at all because he was worried they might join to the South Side if he did, because all he cared about was restoring the Union. So that's really important. And the Emancipation Proclamation was a military tool to win a war. I do value the end results, and I have a lot of respect for Lincoln because I like the end results of what he did, but I'll be the first to admit, none of that, he didn't intend to end slavery. He just wanted to preserve the Union. And we see that, throughout a lot of there's been a lot of studies on why people, they talk about how the Civil War was one of the most written about war from letters from soldiers, because this was before, the military, started censoring, letters, and they just let, anyone talk about whatever they want in the military. And there's tons of letters, and there's been all these studies on why, northern, and there was some, and especially with the 180,000 black soldiers. I mean, those were definitely, they were fighting to free the slaves, and there was a lot of abolitionists that did sign up. But for the biggest reason why people signed up to fight was to restore the Union, and that was for a number of different reasons, economically, also patriotically, also, for a lot of different reasons, but and some did want to, many people want to restore the Union with the racial hierarchy, with slavery still existing, and other people wanted to restore the Union, and they wanted to free, ban slavery, but they still wanted white supremacy to rule. There's only a small part of people that actually wanted to create egalitarian society for black people. That again, though, I mean, I do value the outcomes. I'm very appreciative of everyone who gave their lives on the Union side, and Lincoln himself. And I'm very appreciative, and I think we should honor these people. And the same, because the outcome was they did end slavery, and many of them, eventually became abolitionists because they saw firsthand. I mean, they were fighting in the South and saw what slavery did to people, and that's when they became abolitionists. So, it was an evolving thing, a feeling. But I hesitate. I really caution people who want to say, we don't need to think about reparations or affirmative action or all this other stuff because white people died. White people were the ones that freed slavery. That's not really. That's not the point. And also, we're not asking people to feel guilty, like this, dear white people, no one is asking you to apologize for your ancestors. We're calling on you to dismantle the systems of oppression that you built, that you maintain and benefit from. So no one's like, we're not looking to shame white people. We're not looking to, shame Lincoln. We're just looking to understand the realities of a civil war, especially what happened after the Civil War, which we'll talk about in this class. And we need to, because that many of these realities we're still dealing with today. All right, so now I want to play a short video of Juneteenth. Hopefully this is something, a couple years ago, I doubt anyone, most people, white people have heard about this, but I think there's been a real explosion of Juneteenth lately. And I want to play this video just to make sure everyone understands what Juneteenth is.
My name is Marcia Chatlin. I'm a professor of history and African American studies at Georgetown University. I'm a historian of African American life and culture. Juneteenth is a commemoration holiday of June 19th, 1865, when a group of African Americans in Galveston, Texas, received the news that they indeed were free. President Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, but news of the end of slavery in Texas had not traveled to this community until 1865. Since then, Juneteenth has been a day of commemoration of the struggle against slavery and a celebration of freedom. One of the biggest misconceptions about Juneteenth is that people often think that was the day that slavery ended in the United States. But in fact, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States, was passed in the Senate on April 8th, 1864, and the House on January 31st, 1865. Although Juneteenth celebrates the knowledge that slavery had ended, it's important to remember that the conditions that mirrored slavery, whether it was Jim Crow or the suppression of civil rights, or continued struggles to fight racism, those continued long after the end of slavery. And so the Juneteenth holiday reminds us of where we've come, and it also inspires us to think about the places we want to go. As African Americans left the South to pursue opportunities throughout the 20th century in northern and western cities, the celebration of Juneteenth moved from being a Texas-based celebration to a national one, in which people gathered with families and friends and community to remember the incredible struggle of a people against slavery and to create new traditions that allowed them to reflect about the struggle for civil rights and the ongoing struggle against racism. Although slavery was was abolished in 1865, the fight for civil rights has continued to the present day. So Juneteenth provides people with a sense of encouragement and inspiration to continue to fight on behalf of their community and their families for freedom. And it also is a holiday that, as it continues to become more and more popular, it allows people to look back at the past and encourages them to learn more about African American history. As more and more institutions recognize Juneteenth and work to commemorate the incredible legacy of slavery in the United States, I hope Juneteenth becomes a day where people commit not only to acts of justice in their local community, but to investigate history in a more deep and thoughtful way.
All right. And the last part of this section I want to talk about just what happened after Civil War and after slavery was freed. Frederick Douglass has this great quote. He said, "Egyptian bondsmen went out with the spoils of his masters, and the Russian serf was provided with farming tools and 3 acres of land upon which to begin life. But the Negro has neither spoils, implements, nor lands, and today is practically a slave on the very plantation where formerly he was driven to toil under lash." So that's important to understand. We'll talk about in the next section, Reconstruction, and it's like attempt to try to make, things better. But right off the get-go, when the Civil War ended, there was nothing for no very little, way for Black people, newly freed Black people to provide for themselves. And we saw an enormous amount of famine, public health, I think it was like cholera, or if I'm thinking of the right, but lots of diseases and stuff. And because a lot of Black people were contained in these like refugee camps, and many of them were on lockdowns and in just, all horrific conditions. And at the same time, we saw immediately just like the pure white terrorism, just lash out at newly freed Black people. I'm gonna read this from Carl Anderson from White Ridge. One of the president's emissaries, Carl Schurz, recoiled as he traveled throughout the South and gathered reports of African American women who had been scalped and had their ears cut off, or had been thrown into the river and drowned, and a chance of them to swim to the damn Yankees. Young Black boys and men were routinely stabbed, clubbed, and shot. Some were even chained to a tree and burned to death. And what came to be described as a travelogue of death, as he went from county to county, state to state, he conveyed the sickening, unbearable stench of the decomposing Black bodies hanging from limbs, rotting in ditches and clogging the roadways. White Southerners, it was obvious, had unleashed a reign of terror and anti-Black violence that had reached staggering proportions. So you have to imagine, this is, all of a sudden, General Lee surrenders, the South loses the war, the military, the Union military is protecting Black people in certain areas, but most of the areas, it's just a free-for-all, and it's just a horrific violence, horrific, poverty, horrific, starvation, and we don't have much, data from that time period, but there's been some new books lately that have been written about it that have talked about, hundreds of thousands of Black people died in the first year of emancipation, and it was a horrific situation. And like people had no place to work, they had no place to live. They were kicked off these plantations, but the plantation people still, they still own the plantations, and it was really, it was bad. So I want to play this. I'm going to end. This is the last clip of this section where I'm going to end with Martin Luther King, where he's doing an interview, and someone asks, what is it about Black people that where they after they're freed, it was so hard for them to recover compared to everyone else, and he has a really great response to that.
What is it about the Negro? Every other group that came as an immigrant somehow, not easily, but somehow got around it. Is it just the fact that Negroes are Black?
White America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma. America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps. But it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
Yeah, that last line, it just reminds me, yeah, again, I keep on talking about this, but it reminds me of Brian Stevenson talking about how, I mean, it wasn't just slavery, it was also the justifications, the racist justifications of slavery that persisted, that MLK called it a stigma on black, on black people, that those never, even though the institution of slavery left, all the status, the racial hierarchy, the white supremacy, the anti-blackness, anti-racism, the racism behind it, never left, and that, and that's something that we're still dealing with today. Okay. Oh yeah. There's one last section. I want to talk just briefly about, just a recap of some of these false narratives that we talk about with slavery and how we teach it. And I think a biggest false narrative, we keep on mentioning this, is how we teach slavery as this separate thing in its own chapter, separate from the creation of the United States, separate from the creation of modern Europe, separate from Industrial Revolution. And when in reality, slavery was a major source of finance, provided exploited labor and raw materials needed to build the U.S. and Europe Industrial Revolution. I mean, U.S. was literally founded as a slavetocracy to protect the institutions of the slavery. We read this one part. So slavery and its expansion were central to the evolution and modernization of our nation in the 18th and 19th centuries, catapulting the U.S. into modern industrial and capitalist society economy. In the span of a single lifetime, the South grew from a narrow coastal strip of worn, torn out tobacco plantations to the subcontinent cotton empire. By 1861, it had 5 times as many slaves as it had during the Revolution. It was producing 2 billion pounds of cotton a year. It was through slavery and slavery alone that the United States achieved a virtual monopoly on the production of cotton, the key raw material of industrial revolution, and what transformed into a global empire rivaled only by England. So we see this, we see even, we talk about, I'm going to read this quote, the next one. Slave-grown cotton provided over half of all U.S. export earnings. By 1840, the South grew 60% of the world's cotton and provided 70% of the cotton consumed by British textile industry. Thus, slavery paid for a substantial share of capital, iron, and manufactured good that laid the basis for American economic growth. In addition, precisely because of the South specialized in cotton production, and the North developed a variety of businesses that provided services for the slave South, including textile factories and meat processing industries, insurance companies, shippers, and cotton brokers. So even if it wasn't part of slavery, even if all these industries that were being developed that were making all this wealth for America weren't didn't enslave people, they still made an enormous amount of money from the slave industry. So reality is majority of the industries in America were centered around centered around slavery. Another false narrative: slavery wasn't as efficient as wage labor; it wouldn't have died out on its own. But really, due to these institutional, major techniques of torture, all this cheap lands, cotton gin, slavery, all these things, slavery became the most efficient form of labor in the world at the time. Especially around cotton, around the U.S. cotton, slave plantations. So it's important to understand that. We talked about this, between 1800 and 1860, these techniques of torture, made slaves 130 times as efficient in 60 years. I don't know any, free wage labor that was able to multiply their efficiency by 130 times. So this is not, this, and we downplay this, because we try to downplay how much money we made and all that, and it wasn't an efficient society and all that, because we want to say it wasn't a big deal, when in reality, we often talk about that when we're talking about reparations or trying to, fix past harms. But in reality, it was a big deal, and an enormous amount of wealth was traded, and we do need to do reparations. Another false narrative is only rich people own slaves, and that's a big, that's why I was taught that, mainly white people. I mean, maybe they were fighting for the, idea of owning slaves someday, but enslaved people. But really, this was more, they sell this narrative because it is a better narrative about states' rights and all these things that, people without, non-slave owners, enslavers, non-enslavers were made up majority of the army. But in reality, a huge portion of white people own slaves in the South. In some states, like South Carolina and Mississippi, it was just about half of all white families own enslaved people. I was not taught that. I was taught that it was a small percentage of very rich, people. And granted, there was a huge wealth discrepancies. There's a small group of very wealthy people that own a vast majority of huge plantations, but a huge amount of middle class and lower class people also own enslaved people. And that's, we need to, understand that, and that was through slave mortgages and through investments and through, stealing indigenous land and selling it for cheap. And then the last thing, Civil War happened for other reasons than protecting slavery, like states' rights. And that's a super easy thing to just read any Southern secession speech, and they'll tell you that not only did they oppose, they not only did they, declare, secession because for slavery and white supremacy, but some of them even mention about how they oppose states' rights, northern states' rights, and not enforce federal slave laws like Fugitive Slave Act. Then, okay, so I believe this is the last slide, but I want to end this just on another a 1619 quote. It's a little bit long, I apologize, but it's really good. So Nicole Hannah-Jones really summarizes a lot of this, these false narratives around slavery. She says, the way that we are taught about slavery is that it was a marginalized institution, that it was largely an issue amongst Black backward Southerners, and that it had very little impact on other aspects of our society. And that the things we see in our society now have little to do with slavery and anti-Black racism that's just not true. And the reason why we have tried to marginalize slavery is because it's very uncomfortable, because it reveals that these lofty ideas on which our country was founded were actually not true at the time, and that it took a very long time for them to even begin to be true, and that Black people have had to fight to make them true. We want to believe certain things about ourselves. We have a national memory, and that national memory is that we are an exceptional nation built on individual rights of men to speak about the truth, which is that the men who were writing those words own other human beings and deprive 1/5 of the population of rights and all liberties. It's just a very inconvenient truth to our national narrative. It actually proved that the national narrative is a lie, and so we don't deal with it. Think about how you were taught about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and if we mention that at all that they were enslavers, it is an aside and not central. The truth is 10 of the first 12 presidents were enslavers, and that is significant. That matters. That is not incidental. The reason that our founding fathers even had the wealth and privilege and stature to believe that they could break off from the most powerful empire in the world at the time was because of the profits that they were getting from forced labor or enslaved people. So I think I think we just cannot deal with the inherent hypocrisy of our founding. It goes against every myth we want to believe about ourselves. We don't want to acknowledge that we were just one of the many slaveocracies that existed in the New World, and that we had these lofty ideas that the founding fathers fully did not intend to be for the large segments of populations. Definitely read her whole article. It's and as many articles as you can from the 1619 Project. You could probably read all of them, like a dozen. You could probably read all of them in like maybe an hour to 2 hours, and it's just a wealth of knowledge. All right.